There are moments in a household, quiet moments, ordinary-looking moments, when everything could go one of two ways. When a single piece of news, a single number on a single piece of paper, could either unravel the carefully kept peace of a home or disappear entirely, absorbed before anyone else even knew it had arrived. Most people never see those moments for what they are. They feel them later, in the anxiety that spreads through a house like cold air under a door. But in some homes, in homes run by women like Dorothy Aldrich, those moments come and go without a trace. The family sits down to supper, the children do their schoolwork, the husband reads his paper, and no one knows, not even years later, how close the edges of things came to showing. If you've ever known a woman like that, a woman whose steadiness was not accidental, whose calm was not passivity but preparation, then this episode is for you. And if these stories about the quiet intelligence of an earlier generation resonate with something you remember or something you wish you'd been taught, consider subscribing to this series, because what Dorothy knew is rarely discussed anymore. It was passed down in kitchens and in small gestures and in the habits of women who never called themselves financial planners and yet managed, year after year, to keep their families on solid ground. This part of the story reveals something that Part 1 and Part 2 only hinted at. We've seen how Dorothy organized her pantry and how she maintained her systems, but what we haven't yet seen is what those systems were actually for. Not for abundance, not for the satisfaction of a well-ordered shelf. They were for this, for the morning when something unexpected arrived and the household needed someone who had already thought 3 steps past the problem before the problem announced itself. Stay with this story to the end, because what Dorothy does in the next several days is the clearest picture we have of what quiet strength actually looks like when it's called upon to work. It was a Tuesday in late November, and the morning came in gray and close, the way mornings do when the year has already decided it's finished with warmth. The trees on the street had given up their last leaves the previous week, and the bare branches made the sky look larger than it was, pale and wide, and entirely indifferent to the things happening beneath it. Dorothy had been up since before 6, the way she almost always was, moving through the house in the particular silence she kept for herself before the family's day began. The coffee was on, the furnace had kicked up overnight, and the house held its warmth well against the November chill pressing against the windows. She had been at the table with the ledger when she heard the mail slot. It was earlier than usual for the carrier. She noted this without particular concern, the way she noted everything, as information filed rather than a reason for alarm. She set her pencil down beside the ledger and went to the front hall. 3 envelopes on the floor. She sorted them standing there in her housecoat. A bill from the electric company, a holiday circular from a department store she set aside without opening, and a letter from the Wholesale Grocers Union office addressed to Earl. She set Earl's letter on the side table where he always found his mail. She opened the electric bill at the hall table rather than carrying it to the kitchen, already calculating before she'd fully read it. The number was higher than October. Not dramatically, but by enough that she noticed. She stood for a moment in the hallway with the bill in both hands and did a very specific thing. She decided not to feel it yet. This was a practice she had developed so quietly over so many years that she would have had difficulty explaining it to anyone who asked. It was not denial, it was sequencing. There was a right time to feel the weight of a problem, and there was a right time to solve it. And in Dorothy's understanding, these were not the same moment. Feeling it first, letting the anxiety arrive before the calculations, was how small problems grew large. She had watched it happen in other households, had seen how quickly a number on a bill could become an argument, could become a sleepless night, could become a heaviness that settled over a family and changed the texture of every meal, every conversation, every ordinary exchange, until the bill was just one part of a larger unhappiness that had no specific cause anymore. She put the electric bill in the ledger and went back to her coffee. She would look at it tonight. Have you ever known a person who could do that? Who could set a worry down with the same deliberateness that you'd set a glass on a counter? It's a rare discipline. It doesn't come from not caring. It comes from a deep and practiced belief that the problem will still be there when you're ready for it, and that you are better equipped to face it after you've thought than before. Earl came downstairs at 6:30 in his work shirt and trousers, moving with the unhurried ease of a man who expects his mornings to be comfortable, which they always were, because someone had arranged them that way. Dorothy set his coffee in front of him, and the two of them exchanged the comfortable, minimal conversation of a long marriage. The weather, whether Tommy's cold seemed better, whether she needed anything from the hardware store on his route. The union letter sat on the side table in the hall, unopened, waiting. Earl noticed it on his way out. He picked it up and tucked it into his jacket pocket without opening it at the door, the way men do when they intend to read something later. Dorothy watched him pull his coat on and button it, and she felt something, a small current of attention, a quiet alertness that she did not let show on her face. She had no reason to think the letter contained anything concerning, but she had learned, over years of careful living, that letters from institutional offices, union halls, insurance companies, municipal offices, had a way of arriving with information that required adjustment. An adjustment was easier when you'd begun preparing for it before you knew exactly what you were preparing for. This is what most people don't understand about women like Dorothy. The preparation was not reactive. It was not a response to crisis. It was a continuous, ongoing state, a readiness maintained across the whole of ordinary life so that when something arrived that required it, the resources and the calm were already in place. You don't fill a reservoir during a drought. You fill it in every quiet season before the drought comes. Earl left for work. The children came downstairs. Dorothy made oatmeal and set out the milk and sliced bread and moved through the morning routine with the steady rhythm of a woman who has done this particular sequence of things enough times that it has become its own form of peace. Tommy ate quickly and headed to school. Clara took longer, as she always did, distracted by something she was building in her mind that had nothing to do with oatmeal, and Dorothy waited her out with patience, refilling her own coffee and watching the pale November light shift incrementally across the floor. When the house was quiet again, she sat down with the ledger. She opened it to the current week and looked at the columns with the same level attention she'd brought to everything. The electric bill was there now, noted in her small handwriting. She compared it against the previous month, against the same month last year, against what she had allocated for utilities through the winter. The difference was manageable, but it was a difference, and differences had a way of compounding if you didn't account for them individually. She adjusted the column. The adjustment meant that the amount she'd intended to move to the reserve at the end of the month would need to be smaller. Not eliminated, smaller, by approximately $3.40. She wrote the new figure down. $3.40 was not nothing. It was not a crisis either. It was a number, and numbers could be worked with. She looked at the rest of the week's projections, Thursday's grocery allocation, the coal delivery scheduled for the following week, the small amount she'd set aside for Clara's winter shoes, which the child was rapidly growing out of. She looked at these items the way a chess player looks at a board, not at one piece, but at all of them simultaneously, looking for the move that preserved the most while giving up the least. The shoes could wait 2 more weeks. Clara's current pair, she'd checked the previous Sunday, still had room at the toe, half an inch perhaps.
Children's feet had a way of growing in spurts rather than steadily, and Dorothy had learned not to buy ahead of what was actually needed. 2 more weeks of the current shoes would not harm the child. 2 weeks from now, the reserve would be in better shape, and the purchase could be made cleanly, without borrowing from something else. She wrote shoes, hold 2 weeks, in the margin of the ledger in her small, decided hand. Then she looked at Thursday's grocery allocation. This was where she had the most flexibility, and she knew it. The pantry was in good order, she'd assessed it thoroughly just days ago, and the household was well stocked in the things that formed the foundation of the week's meals. She could reduce Thursday's allocation by enough to absorb the utility difference without the family noticing any change in their meals. It would require being deliberate about the menu for the following week, planning around what was already preserved and stored rather than around what she might have otherwise purchased fresh. It was not deprivation, it was prioritization, expressed through cooking. She was already planning the menu in her mind as she wrote the adjusted figure. Monday would be bean soup with the ham bone she'd been saving in the cold box since Sunday, a rich, filling meal that cost almost nothing because the labor had already been done in the slow cook and the ingredients were already on hand. Tuesday, the meatloaf she made regularly, which stretched far enough to cover both dinner and the next day's sandwiches if she sliced it correctly. Wednesday, the last of the canned tomatoes over pasta, which the children ate with genuine enthusiasm. Thursday, a stewed chicken. She would buy the whole bird rather than pieces, which was considerably less expensive per serving, and what wasn't eaten at dinner would become Friday's soup. The week cost less than she would have spent otherwise, and the family would eat well every night. Do you remember households where this kind of thinking was simply how things were done? Where the cook knew that Monday's roast became Tuesday's hash, became Wednesday's soup, not out of hardship, but out of a refusal to let anything of value go to waste. There was a practicality in those kitchens that has been largely replaced by the convenience of buying separately and specifically for each meal, which is cleaner and simpler in some ways, and in others is simply more expensive without being any better. Dorothy finished her adjustments and closed the ledger. The whole process had taken perhaps 25 minutes. She had identified a problem, calculated its size, distributed the impact across several small decisions, and arrived at a plan that left the household stable and the family unaware. She had not troubled Earl with it. There was nothing he could do that she had not already done, and the worry would have been real to him in a way the solution had not yet earned the right to be. This is perhaps the part of her story that is hardest to explain to a modern audience, the choice not to share the anxiety. It was not secrecy in any damaging sense. Earl knew, in the broad way that men of that era sometimes knew, that Dorothy managed things carefully and that the household was in good hands. He trusted her completely. But trust and information are different things, and Dorothy had a clear philosophy about which burdens were hers to carry alone. A problem she could solve by Thursday was not worth transferring to Earl on Tuesday morning when he had 8 hours of driving ahead of him and nothing to do about it but worry. She had absorbed the anxiety herself. That was the phrase for it, if there was one. She had taken the weight of the unexpected and tucked it somewhere inside her own chest, where it was hers to manage rather than his to share, and where it would dissolve on its own as she worked through it. This was not martyrdom. It was practicality. The household was quieter for it. The children's Tuesday felt the same as their Monday. Earl came home to the same steady atmosphere he always came home to, hung his coat on the same hook, and sat down to the same kind of meal Dorothy had been making since the first year of their marriage. He opened the union letter that evening after supper. Dorothy was at the counter with her back to him when she heard the envelope tear. She did not turn around. She continued what she was doing, rinsing the plates, stacking them in the rack, with the same unhurried motion, but her attention was fully oriented toward the sound of paper unfolding behind her. There was a pause. "Dot," Earl said. She turned then, drying her hands on the dish towel, He was holding the letter with both hands in the particular way that men hold things they're still deciding how to feel about. His expression was careful, not alarmed, but attentive. "They're adjusting the route structure in January," he said. "Some of the longer routes are being consolidated. Might affect hours for a few drivers." Dorothy held his gaze. "Are you on the list?" "Don't know yet. They're posting the new assignments by December 15th. She nodded slowly. "All right," she said. That was all she said. All right. Not, what does this mean for us? Not, how much could we lose? Not any of the questions that were already answering themselves in the back of her mind with the calm efficiency of a system that had been running continuously for 9 years. She said, "All right," turned back to the counter, and finished the dishes. Later, after Earl had settled into his armchair and the children were upstairs, she sat at the table with the ledger open to a fresh page and began mapping out what a reduced income in January might require. She did not know the number yet. She did not need to. She was building the framework. If hours dropped by 10%, here is what we do. If hours drop by 20%, here is the next adjustment. She laid out 3 scenarios in 3 narrow columns with the quiet thoroughness of a woman who understands that uncertainty is not managed by ignoring it, but by identifying every shape it might take and finding your way through each one in advance. By 11 o'clock, she had a plan for each scenario. By 11:15, she had closed the ledger and gone to bed. Earl was already asleep. She lay in the dark and listened to the house settle, the small creaks and sighs of a structure finding its equilibrium in the cold, and she felt, not for the first time, the strange private satisfaction of being the person in a household who holds more of the weight than anyone knows. It was not resentment, it was something closer to purpose. There were people in every family, in every community, who provide stability not through money or force or dramatic intervention, but through the daily, invisible work of anticipating and absorbing and planning. They rarely receive credit for this, because the credit would require people to understand what would have happened without them, and what would have happened without them is, by design, the thing that never did happen. Dorothy's family never panicked, not in that November, not in that January, not in the harder years that came later. They simply continued, and the reason they continued was lying in the dark beside Earl Aldrich, going over numbers in her head before sleep, already several steps ahead of the next thing that hadn't arrived yet.
Have you ever thought about the people in your own life who functioned this way? The quiet preparers, the invisible planners, the ones whose steadiness you took for granted because they had arranged things so thoroughly that there was nothing alarming to see. These were often women, women of a generation that had grown up understanding that the emotional atmosphere of a home was something to be tended, that anxiety was contagious and calm was a choice, that the most powerful thing you could do for the people you loved was to handle the hard things before the hard things became visible. This was not weakness, it was not submission. It was a kind of strength so thorough that it looked, from the outside, like nothing at all. December came in colder than November. Dorothy moved through the weeks before Christmas with her usual precision. The meals planned, the accounts balanced, the small adjustments made so quietly that the rhythm of the household never changed. She had already trimmed the December allocation for personal spending, had already shifted 2 purchases she'd been considering into January pending confirmation of Earl's new route assignment, had already looked at the Christmas budget with clear eyes and made her decisions before the emotion of the season could complicate them. She bought the children modest, specific gifts, chosen not randomly, but from months of quiet observation of what they actually wanted, which she had noted in the back of the ledger in early October, like a woman who understands that the distance between knowing and not knowing is often the difference between a good decision and an expensive one.
She wrapped them in brown paper and white string, which she saved from packages and reused, and she set them in the back of the closet on the high shelf, and she did not look at them again or adjust them because they were right. She had known they were right when she bought them. The 15th of December brought Earl home with news of his new route assignment. He sat down at the table, and Dorothy put coffee in front of him and waited. The hours were the same. The route had been restructured but not reduced. His income in January would be what it had always been. He told her this with visible relief, the relief of a man who'd been carrying something he hadn't mentioned, and she listened with a nod and a small, quiet exhale that she allowed herself because the house was warm and the children were upstairs, and the 3 scenarios she'd built in the ledger in November would remain unused, folded in the back of the book like contingency plans that had done their job simply by existing. Earl reached across the table and covered her hand with his. "I wasn't sure," he said. "I didn't want to worry you." Dorothy looked at her husband, this good man who had been carrying a private anxiety for 3 weeks in order to spare her, and she felt a warmth for him that had nothing to do with relief and everything to do with recognition. They had both been doing the same thing, holding the weight privately, protecting each other from the shape of the worry. It was, she thought, one of the more honest things 2 people could do for each other in a long marriage, not sharing everything, but choosing carefully what to carry alone. "I wasn't worried," she said, and it was true. She had been prepared. This is the lesson that Dorothy Aldrich's life teaches, if we're willing to sit with it long enough, that protection does not always announce itself, that the people who keep households steady are often invisible precisely because they have been so effective, that preparation and panic are in a very real sense choices, not always easy choices, not choices available to everyone equally, but choices shaped by habit and foresight and the willingness to do the quiet, unglamorous work of thinking ahead before you are required to. She protected her family from fear, not by hiding reality from them, but by preparing for it thoroughly enough that fear never had a moment in which to take hold. Do you know someone like that? Have you ever looked back at a period of your life and wondered why things stayed steady when they might so easily have gone another way, and realized, perhaps only later, that someone nearby had been doing the work you never saw? Leave a comment below, because these women deserve to be remembered, and the wisdom they carried deserves to be spoken out loud. If this story has moved you, please consider sharing this video with someone who would appreciate it, a daughter, a sister, a friend who understands the value of quiet strength. And if you haven't already, a like helps more people find these stories, which is the only way they survive. Part 4 of Dorothy's story is coming, and it will take us somewhere we haven't yet been in this series, a moment when preparation alone is not quite enough, when something arrives that doesn't fit neatly into any of the 3 columns Dorothy wrote in her ledger on that November night. Not a crisis, not quite, but something that will ask more of her than planning, something that will ask for grace. Parts 1 and 2 are available in the description below if you'd like to start from the beginning or share them with someone you love. Stay with this story. It's worth seeing through. There is something worth pausing on before we move forward, something about the particular quality of the peace that existed in the Aldrich household that December. It was not the peace of people who had been spared difficulty. Difficulty had been present, quietly, all through November. It had arrived in an envelope, it had lived in the columns of a ledger, it had occupied the private thoughts of both a husband and a wife who were each, in their own way, trying to shield the other from the weight of it. The peace was not the absence of those things. The peace was what Dorothy had built around them, the insulation of preparation, the buffer of foresight, the simple and profound result of a woman who had spent 9 years refusing to be caught without a plan. The children felt none of it. Tommy turned 9 that December and received a balsa wood airplane model he'd been wanting since September. Dorothy had written it in the back of the ledger on the 3rd of October, noted the price at Hendrick's Hobby Shop on Main, and purchased it quietly on a Tuesday morning when she happened to pass by, and the price was exactly what she'd expected. Clara received a set of colored pencils and a drawing tablet because Dorothy had watched her daughter fill the margins of every piece of paper in the house for 6 months and understood, without needing to be told, that this was not a passing phase. The gifts were not grand, they were precise, and precision, when it comes from genuine attention, is more generous than extravagance. Christmas morning was warm in the way that modest, well-managed homes are warm, not lavishly, not performatively, but with the steady, reliable warmth of a furnace that worked and a family that had enough and knew it. Earl carved the turkey, a fine bird, sourced through the warehouse connection Dorothy had asked him to pursue back in October, at a price that fell comfortably within the allocation she'd set for it 6 weeks earlier. The table was set with the good dishes that came out 4 times a year. There was pie, 2 of them, apple and a sweet potato, made from stores Dorothy had been building since summer. Nothing about that table announced itself as the product of discipline. It simply looked like Christmas. It looked like a family that was doing well. And they were doing well, because someone had made sure of it, quietly, before the season arrived, before the letter came, before any of the small pressures of that November had the chance to become anything larger than pressures. That is the full measure of what Dorothy Aldrich gave her family, not just food on a table or money in an envelope or numbers in a ledger. She gave them a life that felt stable, that felt ordinary, that felt like simply the way things were. She gave them the extraordinary gift of not knowing what she had prevented. Most of them never knew. But now you do. There is a particular kind of woman who moves through history without leaving the kind of record that gets studied or cited or placed in any official account of how things worked. She does not appear in newspapers, she does not give speeches, she does not receive recognition at the kind of gatherings where recognition is formally given. And yet, if you were to remove her from the story, if you were to take her out of that house, on that street, in that small American city in the early 1960s, the shape of everything around her would change in ways that would take years to fully understand. Dorothy was that kind of woman. She would not have described herself in any of the terms we might use looking back. She would not have said she was disciplined or strategic or quietly brilliant in the management of limited resources. She would have said she was simply doing what needed doing. And she would have said it without false modesty, not as deflection, but as genuine belief. The work was the work. The planning was the planning. You did it because the alternative was not doing it, and not doing it had consequences she had seen close enough to understand. Her own mother had shown her what those consequences looked like. Not in their household. Her mother had been as careful as Dorothy herself would become, but in the households nearby, in the families on adjacent streets who had not come through the Depression with the same habits intact. She had seen, as a child, what it looked like when a family ran short in the wrong week, the particular silence of it, the way certain conversations stopped when children entered a room, the way a father's face could change when a bill arrived, and the way that change moved through a house like weather, invisible but felt by everyone. Dorothy had decided, somewhere in the unspoken part of her childhood understanding, that her own home would not hold that kind of silence, not because she was certain she could prevent every hardship, she was too clear-eyed for that kind of certainty, but because she believed with everything she had that preparation was the most honest form of love available to her. To ready yourself for what might come was to say, in the only language that mattered, I take this family seriously. I take the future seriously. I will not be caught asleep when the thing arrives that requires me to be awake. And so she was always awake. not in the anxious, sleepless way of someone who fears the future, but in the alert, steady way of someone who has already thought through it and made her peace with the range of possibilities. That was the gift. Not the jars, not the ledger, not the envelope behind the bread box. Those were tools. The gift was the quality of mind behind them, the willingness to look clearly at what was real and to act on it before anyone else had to feel it. That is what December in the Aldrich house was built on, and it is what Part 4 will quietly begin to test.